Think of the last photo you took. Maybe it was nothing important. A meal, a street sign, a face in a crowd you'll never think about again, preserved anyway. Permanently, sitting in a phone you'll probably lose in a few years. Now imagine losing that entire habit. Every single method of freezing a moment in time, gone. No photographs, no video, no way to capture a face, a place, or an event and hand it to someone else exactly as it looked. If you wanted to remember your grandmother's face after she died, you had exactly one tool available, your own memory, and maybe someone else's skill with a chisel or a brush. If you were fortunate enough to afford it. If you wanted to know what a king who died 300 years earlier actually looked like, you had to trust a story, a coin, or a statue carved by someone who may never have seen his real face either. This isn't a hypothetical. This was the entire condition of being human for roughly 300,000 years, only interrupted in the last 2 centuries. By the invention of photography. So how did people build civilizations? Record history, remember loved ones, and pass down entire cultures without a single camera to help them? The answer isn't that they simply lost more than we do. It is that they built entire systems, biological, artistic, and social, specifically engineered to do the job a camera does today, and some of those systems worked with an accuracy that still genuinely surprises modern researchers. Let's start with the most basic problem. Keeping a face after the person wearing it is gone, long before formal art existed. Human memory itself was the only technology available for this, and it turns out human memory for faces is unusually specifically good in a way memory for almost everything else isn't. Cognitive researchers have identified facial recognition as a distinct cognitive specialization processed by a dedicated region of the brain, separate from how we process most other kinds of visual information. This isn't a coincidence. For a social species that depended entirely on recognizing allies, family, and threats correctly, evolution appears to have quietly built a specialized tool for exactly this one job, long before anyone needed to draw a portrait at all. But memory alone fades, distorts, and eventually dies with the person holding it, which is exactly the problem ancient humans needed art to solve. The earliest known figurative art, carved ivory and stone figures and animal depictions found at sites across Europe, dating back over 30,000 years, shows humans were already working to translate memory into something more permanent almost as soon as they had the tools to attempt it. They weren't just decorating, they were building the earliest known backup drives for the human eye. Cave art takes this further, and in some cases with a level of technical skill that still challenges assumptions about what primitive actually means. The paintings at Lascaux in France and Altamira in Spain, some dating back over 17,000 years, depict animals with an understanding of anatomy, movement, and perspective that took formal European art centuries to fully rediscover after antiquity. Some cave artists use the natural contours of the rock itself to give their paintings a subtle three-dimensional quality, animals appearing to bulge or recede depending on where the viewer stood, a technique modern art historians still study for what it reveals about how deliberately these images were composed. Researchers have also found evidence suggesting some of these paintings were created or viewed by flickering torchlight, which would have made certain animals appear to move slightly as the flame shifted, an effect some archaeologists have compared to an early accidental form of animation, tens of thousands of years before film existed. This wasn't idle decoration in a dark, unused corner of the world. Many of these images sit deep inside cave systems, deliberately difficult to reach, suggesting real effort and intention behind both creating and returning to view them. Whatever these images meant to the people who made them, ritual, memory, storytelling, or something we may never fully reconstruct, they represent one of humanity's earliest large-scale attempts to make an image outlast the moment it depicted. Portraiture eventually became the closest thing the ancient world had to actual photography, though it came with a serious catch that photography would later completely eliminate. Ancient Egyptian, Greek, and Roman societies all developed sophisticated portrait traditions, sculpted busts, painted panels, and coin engravings intended specifically to preserve the recognizable likeness of real individual people. Roman portrait busts, in particular, are often praised by art historians for a strikingly realistic, almost unflattering honesty, wrinkles, scars, and asymmetrical features included, rather than the idealized, generic faces earlier traditions sometimes favored. But here is the catch. A portrait's accuracy depended entirely on the skill, honesty, and access of a single artist, working directly from life, memory, or second-hand description. A talented sculptor with genuine access to their subject could produce something remarkably close to a photograph in spirit, if not in speed. A less skilled artist, or one working purely from description or political motivation, could produce something that told you far more about the artist's intentions than the subject's actual face. Political rulers understood this leverage. Well, many ancient portraits on coins and monuments were deliberately idealized, subtly aging or youthening a ruler, exaggerating strength or divinity, propaganda built directly into the only visual record most subjects would ever see of a distant king they'd likely never meet in person. A camera doesn't lie about geometry the way a flattering court sculptor might. Ancient portraiture, useful as it was, always carried the fingerprints, and sometimes the agenda, of whoever held the chisel. For most people throughout history, though, portraiture of any kind was a luxury entirely out of reach, which means for the overwhelming majority of humans who have ever lived, the only surviving record of their existence was never visual at all, it was verbal. Oral tradition, in societies without writing or with limited access to it, carried an enormous burden that modern cameras and written records have almost entirely absorbed today: the responsibility of preserving names, events, genealogies, and appearances across generations, using nothing but trained human memory and repeated performance. In West Africa, specialized oral historians called griots served as living archives for entire families, communities, and royal lineages, memorizing genealogies stretching back many generations, along with the specific stories, songs, and achievements associated with each ancestor. This wasn't casual storytelling passed along loosely. Griot training was often rigorous and lifelong, apprentices spending years memorizing enormous quantities of historical and genealogical material under the direct guidance of an established master, precision expected and actively tested. In ancient Greece, professional performers called rhapsodes memorized and recited massive epic poems like the Iliad and the Odyssey, tens of thousands of lines long, using structured poetic meter and repeated formulaic phrases specifically designed to make such enormous quantities of text easier to hold in memory and recite accurately. Researchers studying oral epic traditions that survived into the 20th century, notably fieldwork among South Slavic epic singers, found performers capable of memorizing and reciting poems tens of thousands of lines long with remarkable, testable consistency across repeated performances. Evidence that trained human memory under the right cultural systems was capable of feats that sound almost unbelievable by casual modern standards. Some cultures went even further, encoding not just stories and genealogies, but entire geographies into memorized, performable form. Aboriginal Australian songlines represent one of the most sophisticated known memory systems ever documented, encoding detailed information about specific routes across enormous stretches of land, water sources, landmarks, dangers, and resources into songs, stories, and ceremonies. Passed down across many generations, researchers studying these systems have found that songlines can preserve accurate navigable information about specific geographic features across staggering distances, some tracing continuous routes stretching well over 1,000 miles across the Australian continent. This wasn't simply memorization for its own sake. These systems functioned as genuine working maps, transmitted entirely without paper, ink, or images of any kind, precise enough that someone could theoretically navigate real specific terrain using nothing but memorized song and story. It is difficult to overstate how demanding this actually is as a feat of memory engineering. A modern camera can capture a landscape instantly and passively. A songline had to be actively rehearsed, correctly performed, and carefully transmitted. Generation after generation, or the map itself would begin to degrade and disappear, along with the people who once knew it. Writing, when it eventually emerged, offered something entirely new information that didn't depend on any single person's living memory to survive at all. Cuneiform tablets from ancient Mesopotamia, some of the earliest writing systems in the world, recorded transactions, laws, letters, and events in a form that could, in principle, outlast every single person who was alive when it was written. But even at its most advanced, ancient writing still couldn't do what a camera does. It could describe a battle, a face, a building, a ceremony in words, sometimes in extraordinary, vivid detail, but it couldn't simply show you instantly and directly exactly what something looked like the way a photograph can. Detailed written descriptions of specific historical figures do survive from antiquity, physical features, mannerisms, clothing, carefully recorded by contemporaries who had actually seen the person in question. But every reader receiving that description still had to reconstruct the image themselves, filtered entirely through their own imagination. No two readers ever picturing quite the same face from the same words. This is precisely the gap photography would eventually close completely and permanently. The difference between being told what something looked like, however skillfully, and simply being shown. Memory itself, meanwhile, was actively trained and engineered as a serious technical skill in the ancient world, treated with a level of discipline modern people rarely apply to it at all. Ancient Greek and Roman orators developed and refined a technique now known as the method of loci, or memory palace, mentally associating specific pieces of information with specific, vividly imagined locations along a familiar mental route, then mentally walking that route later to retrieve the information in order. Roman writers on rhetoric, including Cicero, discussed these techniques as essential professional tools for orators who needed to deliver extremely long speeches from memory with total accuracy in front of an audience, with no notes and no possibility of pausing to check. This wasn't a rare or eccentric skill limited to a few gifted individuals. It was taught systematically as a core expected component of formal rhetorical education throughout much of the ancient Mediterranean world. Modern memory competitors, using essentially the same techniques documented in these ancient texts, have demonstrated the ability to memorize the exact order of multiple shuffled decks of playing cards or thousands of random digits. Within remarkably short periods of time, direct modern proof that these ancient methods weren't exaggeration or myth, but genuinely effective, teachable cognitive technology. Ancient humans didn't just passively hope to remember important things correctly. In the absence of any camera, any recording device, any external backup at all, some of them built and refined an entire deliberate discipline specifically to make the human brain itself into a more reliable one. So how did ancient humans live an entire, full human existence without a single camera to help them? They didn't simply lose the ability to preserve a face, a place, or a moment. They built replacements, layered, redundant, and remarkably sophisticated, out of whatever tools they actually had available. Specialized brain circuitry evolved specifically for recognizing faces, long before anyone needed to draw one cave walls, turned into some of the earliest known permanent images, deliberately built to outlast the moment and the person who made them. Sculptors and painters trained for years to capture a specific, individual likeness, imperfect and politically vulnerable, but often startlingly effective within its limits. Griots, rhapsodes, and epic singers turned their own trained memory into a living, walking archive, capable of holding and transmitting genealogies and entire epics across many generations with tested, demonstrable accuracy. Songlines turned an entire continent's geography into something that could be memorized, sung, and safely navigated by heart. And formal memory techniques turned ordinary human recall into something closer to a deliberately engineered technology, refined, taught, and relied upon exactly as seriously as we now rely on a phone in our pocket. None of it worked instantly, the way a modern camera does. All of it somehow still worked. We didn't invent the need to remember when we invented the camera. We just finally built a tool good enough to stop needing to work quite so hard at something ancient humans had already been quietly mastering, in dozens of different ingenious ways for a very long time.